listening to my favorite talk show, The Weekly Show with other.
This is episode 182 on the 16th of March 2020. The C virus scare was all that was needed to distract us from the discourse around pollution and climate change. Though for some individuals, it has taken a possible pandemic to shake us out of our inertia as far as climate change and pollution goes. For some climate activists, allegedly, this particular virus scare means good news for the planet as a whole, with countries at large and individuals cutting down on travels, that is, fuel consumption is reduced, there are travel restrictions, people are more than happy to practice social distancing, may or may not work in the context of climate change and pollution. But don't be surprised if there are reports about the particulate matter and the AQI being reduced, and one listens and hears on the news that polluted air days are now less in number. Either way, right now the world is not discussing about climate change or pollution. The C virus is the latest discourse, and has it taken the world by storm or not? The health advisories being issued by administrations around the globe are paradoxical in nature. It seems as if this global pandemic scare was a necessary evil and a kick up our rear end to suddenly start being concerned about health and hygiene of individuals when such advisories should be common in the first place. Basic tenets like washing hands, using soap or sanitizer, covering one's mouth while coughing or nose while sneezing are things that should be natural to humans and not suddenly become a norm because now this is global and not personal. But like the discourse around pollution and climate change, where the entire planet pretends to be concerned about events and blames the modern day world, despite humans being responsible for it since the time nomads became settlers. It's the same case with the flu and the virus. We don't need external events to suddenly focus on personal hygiene. Conspiracy theorists will have a field day when they say that this virus was released to paralyze the global economy as this panic has spread to airlines cancelling flights to infected nations and countries putting a curb on exports because they are running out of protective equipment and essential drugs and medicines. OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development representatives have said that the outbreak of COVID-19 presents the global economy with its greatest financial crisis, raising the risk of restrictions on movement of people, goods and services and hurting business and consumer confidence. It also estimated that the world economic growth would slow down to 2.4% in 2020 compared to 2.9% in 2019. This has also exposed the double standards of hotels, restaurants, and other similar allied interests. Now, to allay the fears of their customers, it is quite an eye-opener that only after the news and rumors of this virus spread that hotels, restaurants, metro stations, malls have gone on a spiral, suddenly caring to install hand washing stations, focusing on packaging and food hygiene and disinfecting the premises. Now the question is, should not have these practices be followed every day. Does it mean that they took all this for granted before and now all this is just collateral damage? It also shows that the city councils did not fine restaurants and hotels before if they failed to follow all these practices as a daily routine. It means that both the city councils and eateries and hotels have shown their hypocrisies and the fact that they were sleeping until this global scare broke out, and now to placate their bosses and citizens, they are going on the all out to show their involvement and concern. It will be interesting to see how illegal and undocumented food vendors who sell golgappas and other assorted junk food on pavements where the word hygiene does not exist in their intellect react to all this. One of the reasons the majority enjoys meals from these illegal, unhygienic, and undocumented eateries is because it is cheap, far away from the formal setting of a restaurant, and the craze of eating food where the cook cleans his hands and the stuff and utensils from the same cloth is quite thrilling. The bees buzzing around the stove and consumers nonchalantly thwarting them away, often inexplicably, adds to the thrill of being an Indian. Terms like pandemic, epidemic, isolation, and quarantine have been floating around as city administrations and governments have been using these words to tell people that we are on a lockdown and restricting travel. But as citizens, do we understand what these terms mean? Let's delve into the meanings and understand these terms in a more detailed manner. An epidemic is defined as an outbreak of disease that spreads quickly and affects individuals at the same time. A pandemic is a type of epidemic, one with greater range and coverage, an outbreak of a disease that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects an exceptionally high proportion of the population. While a pandemic may be characterized as a type of epidemic, technically one would not say that an epidemic is a type of pandemic. Both words have functions and meanings. Each word entered English as an adjective before being used as a noun beginning in the 17th century. An epidemic plague is a common and popular sickness happening in some region or country at a certain time caused by a certain indisposition of the air or waters of the same region, producing in all sorts of people one and the same kind of sickness. This was quoted by Thomas Lodge, a treatise of the plague 1603. According to the Webster's Dictionary, these predicates certainly are not convertible with the aforementioned diseases and therefore ought not so rashly to be pronounced the scurvy, which moreover is endemic. The others are epidemic and pandemic. According to Gideon Harvey, The Disease of London 1675. What are the origins of epidemic and pandemic? Let's try and understand that. Epidemic, which may be traced to the Greek epidemos, within the country among the people prevalent of a disease, may carry broader meanings such as excessively prevalent, contagious, or characterized by very widespread growth or extent. Pandemic is less often encountered in a broad and non-medical sense but does have additional senses, including affecting the majority of a people in a country or a number of countries. Found in most parts of the world and in varied ecological conditions and of or relating to common and sensual love. Pandemic comes from the Greek word pandemos of all the people, which itself is from pan, that is all or every, and demos, that is people. Now I hope that it's clear that what is the difference between pandemic and epidemic. Now the impact of the WHO declaring this a pandemic means that the world is under isolation and quarantine never seen before. Isn't one curious to know what is the difference between isolation and quarantine? Let's get into a discourse about the difference between isolation and quarantine. The first permanent hospital for treating plague victims was established in Venice in 1423 on a nearby island called Santa Maria di Nazareth. The hospital was initially referred to as Nazareto, a term based on the name of a biblical location for which the island was named, Nazareth. That was then blended with the biblical name Lazarus to become Lazaretto, meaning a hospital for those with contagious diseases. Lazzaro, based on Lazarus, was the Italian term for leper. The hospital's location on an island is a vivid and relevant example of the root of the word isolation, which ultimately derives from the Latin word insula, meaning island. The word's path from Latin to English also begins in Italian with the word isolato, isolated. That became the French word isolé and then moved into English. Early users of the term English were spelled in a French manner with a conventional English modifier marked D as isolard before it settled in the spelling isolated. The reason the lazaretto was on an island was to isolate the patients. Etymologically, the word isolated means islanded. A verb was subsequently coined to correspond to this adjective, which is how the term isolate was formed in English. Given its classical roots, isolated is a relatively new word in English, only dating back to the late 1700s. Isaac Disraeli, in his Warren or the Sketches of the Times in 1797, said that philosophy is very narrow, that gives, for the cause of Jewish isolation, the strict inhibition of Moses against idolatrous practices. Idolatry has ceased, but they are still isolated. According to another philosopher, Francois Alexander Frederick de la Rochefoucauld, travels through the United States of North America 1799, said that this entire isolation of the place where the smallpox breaks out, such as the law of Virginia prescribe, cannot be carried into effect with all the conditions necessary to render it salutary. Now let's try and understand the origins of the word quarantine. Quarantine has Italian and French influences in its word, which contributed to the introduction of the word quarantine in English. The French word quarantaine, about 40, was borrowed in the late 1400s with the meaning a period of 40 days. Just like any other term, it has a biblical reference. This originally referred to the period of time Jesus spent fasting in the desert. Then in the 1600s, the meaning isolation of a ship to protect the port city from potential disease began to be used in English from the Italian word quarantina. The new isolation as protection from disease since became a new use of the existing word quarantine. In the contemporary times, quarantine means 14 days. The current practice of 14 days of quarantine has more to do with modern medicine than any etymological connection to the Latin root of 4. That 14 and 40 are similar is just a coincidence of epidemiology and etymology. What is the simple difference between quarantine and isolation? The simplest of terms, isolation is used to separate ill persons who have a communicable disease from those who are healthy. Quarantine is used to separate and restrict the movement of well persons who may have been exposed to a communicable disease to see if they become ill. This was coined by the US Department of Health and Human Services. The US and India look at this disease or the C virus in two very distinct manners. While the US has declared this as a national emergency, on the other hand, the Indian government has declared this as a notified disaster. Let's look at the difference between the two. President Trump said that to unleash the full power of the federal government for this effort today, I am officially declaring a national emergency. The national emergency is defined as a state of emergency resulting from a danger or threat to a nation from foreign or domestic sources and usually declared to be in existence by government authority. On the other hand, India has declared this as a notified disaster. The central government has declared the outbreak a notified disaster. In India, enabling states to use state disaster relief funds for screening and containment efforts. Home Ministry in an order to the state chief secretaries said, keeping in view the spread of COVID in India and the WHO declaration on the disease, the center has decided to treat it as a notified disaster for the purpose of providing assistance under the state disaster relief fund. This is interesting as to how two countries view the same outbreak as two different terms. While one country declares it as a national emergency, the other country terms it as a notified disaster. It means that the NDRF, National Disaster Relief Fund, and FEMA, that is the Federal Emergency Management Authority, can use funds at the discretion of both the center and the federal governments of India and USA to help in relief and containment efforts. This is how this outbreak has changed the worldview of different countries. As the world steps down on its lockdown efforts, which includes travel restrictions from country where the virus has spread, as well as the domestic restrictions on the usage of malls, schools, and other institutions. The world is on a virtual lockdown as different states have shut down schools, colleges, and cinema halls where a large congregation of people usually gather. Classes have been suspended in universities such as IITs, IIMs, IP, and JNU, which means there will be virtual classes. Students will have to submit their assignments through emails and electronic portals, and with social distancing being practiced in the current times, an individual's mobile phone and other electronic gadget become even more important in this isolated world. Once upon a time, one would want a social distance from one's mobile phones. Now, with such restrictions being imposed, that's the only device that is present to communicate, either through emails, text, or digital networking sites. This means the phone and the internet companies as well as the electricity companies will have to work overtime to provide these services. Don't be surprised if your messages and calls don't go through because everybody is using this device to communicate for professional or personal reasons. What has staying at home done for individual? It means binge watching will become the new norm. Binge watching is not the ideal way to spend time at home when one is forced to do so, but that is the only thing that is left in an individual's armory, which means watching movies and the movie Contagion, which came about 9 years ago, which was not considered and taken seriously when it was released 9 years ago in 2011, considering its dark plot and theme. One has heard the term art imitates life, but has anyone heard the term life imitating art? This particular movie is now suddenly a cult movie. This movie is the right kind of intervention that is needed, and one has never been hooked onto a movie which is so close to the events happening in the present times. Watching movies, communicating through text, emails, phones, and social networking sites means expect inflated phone and electricity bills. This means that the tech sector has become the new best friend of individuals with an array of lifestyle solutions making social distancing easier. Thanks to this outbreak of COVID-19 and with people hunkering down and spending time at home as the work from home becomes a new norm and social distancing is the way to go about for the next couple of weeks. This information can also become a factor. While the mobile phone becomes the new best friend, one has to be wary of the information in the virtual world. Before sharing any information on this particular outbreak, individuals should look at the text or the videos being circulated, and before they send it forward to other individuals, be smart about what the information is. Is it correct? Is it misinformation? Is it leading to panic? Are the sources in these videos and texts correct? Can they be trusted? This might become an important lesson in what's the correct information and what's not. What are rumors, what is fact, and what is fiction? Individuals will have to be wary about the sources. So think twice before sharing such information, so lest it not become a panic state. Thank you for listening to this very special episode. This ends episode number 182 on the 16th of March 2020.
And you're listening to my favorite talk show, The Weekly Show with